Without further ado, then let's jump in. I will share again. And okay, so you should have the agenda on the screen. I'm notorious for accidentally leaving an agenda up for an entire meeting and everyone just stares at it the whole time. I don't do enough of these to be in good practice. I'm usually an attendee. So if I do make that mistake, holler at me and I'll make sure to get our faces back on. I think this meeting should be to the point. We covered a lot of the context and sort of that background info last meeting. I would still like for us to do a brief round of introductions, but last time, we talked about ourselves and our particular interest or connection to multifamily housing, affordable housing in Estacada. We're going to skip that and just stick to names, organizations, and roles just for the sake of everyone's review. And I just realized I need to pull up, and I don't have it readily available. So the first item on our agenda is just to review a purpose and the charge from City Council. So I'll just briefly say, as a summary, our responsibility here is not necessarily to draft policy, to conduct research, or collect data. We're here to make recommendations to the City Council for things that they may want to take a deeper dive into in terms of policy, programs, or other initiatives that may promote the development of multifamily and diverse types of housing in the city. And that's our responsibility. Last meeting, we established a goal of trying to have recommendations to the council by the end of summer, so like August, September. We will try and stick to that. And I think we'll have a better feel after today and maybe even next meeting whether or not we're on track to meet that goal. So without further ado, then, I'll briefly say my name is Matt Lorenzen. I work for the City of Estacada. My role is Economic Development Manager. Something like this probably doesn't fall squarely underneath the umbrella of economic development traditionally. In many jurisdictions, economic development is strictly based on growing the economy, business development, recruitment, retention, tourism development, et cetera. And I do plenty of those things, but our city staff is small and we wear lots of hats, each of us. And so this falls on my desk. So Taylor, why don't you go next and then call on someone else after you.
Thanks. Yeah, Taylor Campy. I'm the city planner for Estacada. And yeah, I would agree with what Matt just said about this being not exactly an economic development or exclusively an economic development issue. Certainly overlaps a lot with what I do in the planning world. So that's why I'm here too. And I will go ahead and call on Ryan.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Taylor. My name is Ryan Carpenter, and I serve as the superintendent for the Estacada School District. Happy to be back and be a part of this. And I will call on my good friend Heath Stallcup next to introduce himself.
All right. My name is Heath Stallcup. I own Heritage Properties and Investments and long-term Estacada resident, and just happy to be a part of the committee. I will, man, I don't see the list of people here. I'll call on Ben Wheeler next.
Thanks, Heath. Ben Wheeler, also a longtime Estacada resident and local builder, local school board member, and just involved in all things Estacada. Roseanne, why don't you go ahead? No.
Maybe tied up with kids. You want to?
All right. Let's go ahead to go to Deborah Buffton.
Oh no, sorry guys, I'm here. Roseanne's here.
Oh,
I'll call on Deborah
perfect.
after myself. Okay, so Roseanne Johnson with the Home Builders Association of Metro Portland. And we obviously are a trade association, a 501c6 nonprofit. So we obviously advocate for our members' interests, but our members build all types of housing. So we are also a housing advocate for all types of housing, everything from ADUs to attached product, detached product, mixed use, and your traditional, maybe traditional for some, larger, detached executive style housing. We also have members that build, apartments and condos, and really excited to be here. Thanks, Matt and Taylor and the team for reaching out to us. Deborah.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing those kid giggles in the background. That was fabulous. I'm Deborah Buffton. I'm the executive director of the Estacada Area Food Bank. We interact regularly with people at the lower income levels here in our town, people who are struggling to find housing or don't have any at all. And I will call on Joe. I don't think.
Hi, everybody. Joe Solkowski from Recon Craft. We're a boat builder in the industrial park. First, apologize for not making the last meeting, but glad to be a part of this. And with Recon Craft, we are primarily invested and focused on building boats for the military and government agencies. And acquisition of proper talent is probably the hardest thing that we do, probably just like any business owner. And I think a key component of that is the housing availability and affordability locally. So pleased to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I don't know if we called on Dave yet.
No, not yet.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, Dave Carbonell. I'm a developer of affordable housing, mostly in Portland. We are doing a project with older adults, so in Madras, and working on a veterans project with Do Good in Portland.
Perfect. Thank you. So I'm just going to quickly identify who we're missing. We are missing a representative from the Housing Authority of Clackamas County. Last meeting, that was Joe Vaness. He's tag teaming with Jill Smith, who's the director of the Housing Authority of Clackamas County. Unfortunately, neither were able to make this meeting. So a little disappointing, but of course, people's schedules are busy and fill up. And then, who else are we missing? Sorry, 1 second, bear with me. Oh, yes, Kelly Klassen, who was kind of a member at large, resident in the community, and a local renter and interested in these issues. Before moving on, I'll say a quick word. One member of the committee contacted me after our first meeting and applauded the city's efforts to do more in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. At the same time, pointed out that this committee does not necessarily stand out as an example of diversity. I'm laughing. Perhaps it's not a laughing matter. I will just say that recruiting 9 members to fill out the various roles that the city council wanted to see represented on this committee was a challenge itself. To take a step further and try and find folks that were willing, able, and met the descriptions of the roles we needed, who also might maybe fit into the BIPOC description or something more diverse than I suppose the faces we see here, was an extra challenge. And I don't know that we've lived up to our goal in this particular instance to be better examples of diversity, equity, and inclusion. I just wanted to note for the record that we are striving as a city to work toward that goal. As we're aware, Estacada, while it does have diversity, it's still, 90+% white folks, for lack of a better term. Please excuse my lack of proper terminology there. So it can be very difficult in certain situations, especially where we had specialized roles that we needed here, to find representatives that come from more diverse backgrounds. So just wanted to note that on the record and say that it remains a goal of the city. And where possible, we'd certainly love to hear from all members of the community once this committee's recommendations make it to the level of being considered by the city council. There will certainly be public input opportunities, and we would hope to invite as many people of as many backgrounds to contribute and comment as part of that process. And thank you to the member that sort of pointed that out. It's we need those reminders. I'll move then to the minutes, and I'll share those on my screen. These went out just a short time ago, and I apologize for that delay. I've been on some personal leave and playing catch up, and that was the timeline I was able to meet. But briefly, for those who have not been able to review, we basically followed the agenda pretty closely. I tried to capture the comments that were made by people who chimed in and shared during this section where we were talking about the housing needs and how those are observed by various members of the committee. We talked about the genesis of this committee. It's sort of an outgrowth of the conversation about a construction excise tax. The city council said we're not quite ready to enact something like that without exploring other tools. And so we'd like to form a committee to look at those and discuss those. And that's how we got here. As mentioned just a moment ago, our timeline is to hopefully have something to bring to the council by the end of summer, if not sooner. There were a few questions and comments before we jumped into our brainstorming session. Ben, Katie, and Joe each had something to contribute, and I tried to capture the essence of their comments. And then we got into our brainstorming. Here's the list that we were able to put together as a committee. And we adjourned. At that time, we did not have a meeting time set, but we figured that out over Doodle poll. And here we are for meeting number 2. So we don't have a chair of this committee. This is kind of an ad hoc committee that is not as formal as a standing committee of the city or commission of the city. But would someone like to motion or not, as the case may be, or ask for amendments to the minutes and then a second?
I'll move to approve the minutes.
Second, third, fourth.
Okay, I guess for the record, we'll say that Ben Wheeler has moved to approve the minutes as written and presented, and that Deborah Buffton came with a second. So those in favor of adopting the minutes as written, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, we'll consider those adopted, and they're already published on the website and as a draft, but we'll go ahead and formally adopt those. So moving right along, we're going to get right to work. I will maybe reopen.
Can I ask a question, Matt? This is Deborah.
Yeah, yes, please.
When we, sent, one thing I forgot to bring up at our last meeting and has been, the opportunity to remind me has come forward as it has happened again, is in our brainstorming, did we talk at all about temporary or long-term local possibilities, and this might be zoning, I'm not sure the language to be using, but we have these situations frequently where people are dwelling together as they can, whether that be in a motorhome on someone's property or wherever, and then there's a complaint made and people get shifted based on county investigative processes. So would there be something we could do even on a temporary basis or an emergency basis kind of way while we're in this period where the reality is there's not enough built housing? Are there some things we could do to just make it easier for people to stay where they are when they are there?
I guess the best answer I can give is I don't know, but what specifically would you be looking for? So you mentioned,
for example, would there be a short-term process we might be able to implement that, I've got someone living in my driveway. I'm just making this up. I've got someone who has an RV that it's fully contained. I'm okay with them living. I'm a private property owner. I'm okay with them living on my property. Is there some sort of, I know we have the hardship variances that you can get through the county to have someone residing on your property when it's a single dwelling zoning. But is there something locally we could do? I don't know the language, so sorry, but
Taylor, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot. Are you familiar enough with our camping ordinances to talk about how those might be relevant to the question?
I'm not, but that's something that I'd be happy to at least look into and maybe get in touch with Ben or Glenn at the county. Find out what they would see as some options there. It sounds like kind of a combination of figuring out whether things could be allowed in the existing zoning or whether zoning could be changed to allow things like that, or to provide some kind of like a hardship variance maybe, which is, I don't think that's something that the city has. And or is there some way that we could, are there temporary agreements or something that we can do with code enforcement? Because it sounds like what's happening a lot is that people will call in with a complaint, which triggers code enforcement to go out and cite them,
Right. I just want to be sure that as as a committee, that we're incorporating also those short-term transitional time period. It is going to be some time before we have enough built housing in our community, regardless of all our efforts. So what are the things that we can do to keep people stably housed? And I use quotation marks around housed there, whether that be in a tent, whether that be in an RV, whether that be, I'm not sure what the other options, in a hotel. There's a continuum, right? So I want to be sure the committee is looking at the full continuum of housing.
Just a thought on that, and I'm not sure where it's going in Portland, but they've taken a kind of a broader, more liberal view of their ADU requirements. And so they're starting to kick around some of these different ideas about what can be the secondary house associated with a primary resident. Not sure whether there is an ADU policy in place in Estacada, but if there was, that might be a way to kind of extend that to give people more options.
Yeah, we do have code around ADUs, and it is pretty specific. So that's something we could consider looking at, either changing the chapter on ADUs, or adding some other sort of definition of an accessory unit. Yeah, that's something.
Yeah, that sounds like that might be a good spot to start, at least.
Yeah, so perhaps a segue, thank you for that, by the way, but it's a good segue, I think, into our work session here. What we identified and put down in this draft set of recommendations, tried to have it meet 3 criteria. The first of which, and I mentioned this in the email, that whatever the recommendation is, that it be technically and administratively feasible. The second, politically feasible. And third, efficacious is the word I use, but that it had the potential to actually make a difference. And I'm not saying that this is good or bad. I'm just saying it is. Restructuring codes to allow, for example, tent camping on a semi-permanent or permanent basis on someone's private property within city limits is going to be politically difficult. Again, I'm not saying that that's good or bad. I'm just saying it is. It is going to be politically difficult. Let's just keep in mind as we talk about our recommendations to City Council, those 3 criteria. And if we want to add to those, I'm certainly open to adding criteria. But again, technically and administratively feasible, politically feasible, and efficacious, potentially efficacious. So let me share a different screen. Where is it? Okay. So here's what I distributed yesterday, I believe, for a draft set of ideas. This is obviously only 5, no, excuse me, 1, 2, 3, yeah, 4, 5 things. And our list was 3 or even 4 times that many items. I added in my comments to this committee that these were what stood out to staff as meeting those 3 criteria. But if you all decide in this meeting, you think this isn't, they're going in the wrong direction, it can all be discarded and we can start over right now. But we wanted to have a starting point for discussion. We can move through these individually maybe, and then jump into some more ideas to add to this list. Deborah, for example, your idea, I think maybe we can jump back into that question with an eye to those 3 criteria in just a moment. If that sounds okay to everyone, let's again start at the top. We'll move through these and then see what changes we want to make and additions or subtractions. I want to give an update on where the city stands with the creation of a vertical housing development zone. We're slightly delayed, but not too far off track. We were supposed to be putting a resolution in front of the city council at their next meeting, which is the 12th of April. That's been slightly delayed as the Board of County Commissioners has, for various reasons, taken a particular interest in wanting to learn more about this before they sign off on not allowing this to go forward, because we can do it with or without the county's blessing. But if they opt out, that means several of the special taxing districts that they govern, which would include the county rural jurisdiction, I think vector control. Anyway, there's 3 or 4, I believe. If they did not want to participate in the tax abatement program, they do have the ability to opt out, and then the incentive to a developer trying to take advantage of this tax credit program would have a smaller incentive because they opted out. So we're scheduled, I can't remember which day in April, but I will be presenting in front of the Board of County Commissioners to basically, for lack of a better term, sell them on this program and why we would like their support and for them to not opt out and to participate. And then we would look to put this back on the agenda for the city council to go ahead and implement through resolution, probably the beginning of May. It's possible the end of April, but probably the beginning of May. So slightly delayed, but not too much. And that looks like it's more than likely going to move forward. If there's anyone on this committee that feels like this is a terrible idea, I guess now would be the time to vocalize that. Okay, hearing no objections.
Sorry, Matt.
Yeah.
This is Roseanne. Actually, the opposite of an objection. I wanted just to add something onto this because I am aware that Commissioner Schrader with the Clackamas County Board is, coming to tour with you guys a particular site for the potential maybe of a partnership for multifamily housing in Estacada. And I'm just wondering if it might be a consideration for the county and for Estacada to designate whatever area that you guys come into agreement on for a project, if that were to happen, to be part of the VHDZ. So just an idea under the category of the vertical housing development zone, because I know that I believe your council directed staff to pursue it in the downtown area. And of course, you don't know yet where any potential project might be with the county for multifamily housing. So just trying to connect those dots if it were to be in alignment in terms of the geographical area.
Okay.
Or nearby.
I'm making that note right now. I think it's technically possible. You're right. A couple representatives from the county commissioners are going to be coming to Estacada to tour with a couple staff people and the mayor, a potential site. There's a lot that is really unknown right now about the two sites that are being considered. Starting with, are the owners of the property even willing to transact? That's still unknown right now. So I like where you're going. If a site, I think what you're trying to say is if we do identify a site where we can partner with the county on a potential development of affordable housing, can that site be added to the vertical housing development zone? Did I get that right?
Yes, exactly. Perfect summary.
Okay, thank you. So let's move then to a hairier topic, the construction excise tax. So this one is, of course, a little bit hazy in terms of political feasibility. We're still trying to understand political feasibility. From an administrative and a technical standpoint, it seems doable. It's certainly going to add a little bit to city staff's burden, but seems manageable. Efficacious, based on what Councillor Dunsmuir has presented, it seems like there is potential for this program, if implemented, to move the needle, to create a fund that might make something happen and put some housing on the development pipeline. I guess I'm just going to invite an open discussion right now about construction excise tax and whether or not this group can form a consensus on whether or not this ought to be included in recommendations. There's going to be some varying opinions on this, and so I guess I want to allow this time right now for those opinions to be expressed and to then see if we're arriving at some sort of consensus one way or the other. So with that, anyone want to raise their hand and chime in on this topic?
I would just be curious how that political feasibility maybe differs based on whether the CET would be the full 1% or, some jurisdictions have done, I think in Bend, do they do like 1/3% or something like that? Yeah.
It's some fraction of a percent. I could be wrong.
Yeah. So I wonder if it's, might be.
So real quick here, just to clarify, 1% of the permit value, a 1,500 square foot house in the city of Estacada you're gonna be somewhere in the neighborhood of $30,000 for permits and SDCs. is that going to be 1% of $30,000 or 1% of that perceived value of that $400,000 home?
Yeah, it's been a while since I've dug into that. Roseanne probably is better equipped to answer that question than I am. Roseanne, do you know the answer to that?
My understanding is it's the percentage is based on the valuation of the improvements. So whatever your permit value is.
So not necessarily market value, but
So
more along the
that
lines of like a tax
that is
assessed value.
correct. Yeah, Ben, that's correct. The property we developed recently in Bend, the amount that they added, which was just basically a third, was on the finished value of the property. And I want to make sure that I'm clear. I'll always do whatever everybody agrees to. But last time I mentioned, even though I don't like it, that the CTE has value. After doing some more research on exactly the difference between what we would probably be implementing versus the reason Ben put it in place, I don't think Estacada is a good fit for this personally. Ben puts 95% of their resources into community development in actually their parks and rec. So when you go to Bend, they like by 5 times they draw in more people in the state of Oregon than any other place in Oregon, by like 5 times. And that's all because of what they put into their parks and rec system. And I don't see Estacada becoming a Bend through this tax. That's how they maintain the services they have. They started with those services. They didn't just do the tax to build those services, but that's how they maintain those services. So that being said, I'm not sure this tax is going to do what we think it's going to do. I think it's going to be a political nightmare, but that's just my opinion.
So I think Roseanne has her hand up and I want to call on her next. I just wanted to ask a question, Heath. I'm unclear about how Bend would be using those funds for parks and rec development. As I understand it, the CET revenues must be used for housing related incentives and programming.
So the residential portion, yes, it has to be related to housing. 50% goes to OHCS, 35% goes to programs that you would do, 15% goes to incentives, I think. Or no, 35, that might be flipped around.
Is it down payment assistance, the 15?
Yeah, things like that. So incentives for home ownership. And then on the commercial side, you do have a little bit more leeway in terms of what the upper threshold of the percentage is, but you also have more leeway in what you can do with that money. And so some jurisdictions that have enacted a CET on the commercial side, they put a percentage of the funds that they have the choice of where it goes. They put that towards it could be classified as economic development programs. So that's probably, and without being super well versed in what Ben did, that's probably, they took it maybe from their commercial side into Parks and Rec.
And I'm speaking from a commercial standpoint. Everything I talked to, the people I talked to, were all on the commercial side. So that's probably, Matt, to answer your question, the information I was given was based off the commercial tax.
Okay. I think what Councillor Dunsmuir has been advocating for, I can't remember if she had a strong opinion one way or another on the commercial and industrial construction excise tax, but she's most interested in capturing this revenue on all of the permits we're issuing for single family construction. Yeah, so I believe that's what we're looking at in the Estacada context, is whether or not we want to implement this with the intention anyway, at least during the policy formation phase, of directing whatever revenues may be realized toward affordable housing, multifamily housing development.
I'll just come out and say it. I'm opposed to it.
Okay. Any variation, any iteration of it, just opposed?
I think there's other things that we can do that could be a better value add for trying to get a developer here, like creating land inventory that is ready for these more aligned with these type of projects.
Okay.
And I think if the city is dead set on being part of this plan, the first step is getting skin in the game. I said it last time, I'll say it again, I'll probably say it 14 more times. The city has to have skin in the game, whether it's SDC abatement, streamlined permit processes, all of those things. I think we need to exhaust all those things before we decide to tax one segregated group of people, which is home builders. And realistically, it is all those new home buyers that are buying these houses in all the subdivisions. It's a very segregated, small piece of the market. And I don't think that we should artificially increase all of those houses by 1%, or on a $400,000 house, you're going to increase it by $4,000 to try to augment and try to attract somebody to come in and build low-income housing. I think there's other ways to do it. And if the market wants it, the market will get it at the end of the day.
Okay, so that's noted. Is there anyone who wants to come out and say that they feel passionately that, yes, the construction excise tax is what Estacada needs? Just want to give an opportunity for both sides of the argument. Okay, I'm not hearing any right now. I think if Councillor Dunsmuir were here, she'd probably speak up, but she's not here today. So for the moment, I guess we're going to go ahead and eliminate that from the draft recommendations. It sounds like since no one is speaking up firmly in favor of it, can I at least get some hands raised or some nods on the screen to say that the consensus of this committee is that we not include a CET in our recommendations at this time?
I agree.
I would like to just, for the record, also state that I believe in Ben Wheeler's statement too about the free market and just allowing that demand to take its own place, different than us forcing things. If the demand is there, then I believe they will come. And so I just wanted to add to that because I agree with what Ben was saying.
Okay.
And then I would say that from HBA's perspective, which again, all forms of housing, it's like we are curious what an excise tax, where the threshold cutoff would be. And I think that because that question is not answered in terms of what housing affordability levels are you taxing versus which ones you aren't, what are the questions of equity there? I mean, do you cut it off at 350,000? Do you cut it off at 300,000? Assuming they're all market rate construction, I mean, if a developer can build to the 275 range, but it's market rate, does that get taxed too? And it just doesn't seem right that, every layer of housing would get taxed if really what your goal is to allow for more affordable projects to be relatively more affordable and attainable to households coming into your community and that are in your community. The second point about the CET is that, like Ben said, it really targets one particular area of the business community within your city that's coming to do business there. And so we would want very strongly to see that other businesses or other community members, including the city, which is an employer within your community, to have some sort of investment. If the builders and developers are going to invest in affordable housing through a CET, then the city and the rest of the community at large should also invest in some way, whether that be through a general option levy or further tax abatement from the city's perspective, or some other tool or mechanism.
Okay. Yeah, so some of the other things I included in the recommendation sheet here were meant to sort of balance. My assumption going into this is that there was going to be more support for a CET than what I'm hearing. And so some of the other suggestions and recommendations I included on this table tried to provide, I guess, that balance that you're talking about, where if developers are going to be charged on one side, then what can we do to try and even the scale up and make sure that they're benefiting some way to try and balance that out. But at this point, it sounds like that conversation is unnecessary just because this group is sort of forming a consensus that now is not the time, or it may never be the time for a CET in Estacada. So I guess let's jump down to deferral of SDCs. This is something that Roseanne and I have talked about, and Taylor as well, to some extent our city manager. And from the city's standpoint, administratively, I don't know that there's any objection to this concept. So what, more specifically, what's being proposed here is that instead of SDCs being collected at the time of permit issuance, and therefore creating an additional carrying cost for developers, the SDCs would be collected at the time of either the closure of permits or certificate of occupancy. I guess that's more or less one and the same thing. And so eliminating that carrying cost for a developer, and thereby hopefully, in theory anyway, right, if you lower the costs for a developer, that's going to mean that the retail cost of the product is going to be lower. Again, in theory, there would be nothing to prevent developers from still charging the same amount they would if they had to pay their SDCs on the front end rather than the back end. But so anyone want to speak to that? Again, I don't believe that the city, from an administrative standpoint, has any objection to it. We don't see it as potentially any sort of loss of revenue. I captured in the comments here the potential that maybe a project would get started but never finished and just kind of sit there, and then in that case the SDCs wouldn't be collected. But that probably doesn't matter anyway, because that piece of product is not contributing to the city's system burdens. So anyway, I don't think the city perceives this as being problematic in any way. Do we want to include this in our recommendations to defer SDCs to the back end of a project instead of the front end?
I'm curious, how does that promote, like, for me personally, Ben, I'd be curious of your opinion of this, but for me personally, if I'm going to build a building in Estacada, whether I pay that fee up front or I pay it at the end, I'm still paying that fee. It doesn't do anything more for me to want to do something in Estacada just because it's deferred to the end of the project. So I'm not sure that the deferring it to the end of the project is necessarily, I can't remember who brought that up, like who in the last meeting, but if that's what they meant by deferred SDCs.
I think the genesis of it, Heath, was like the Polish Homes type of scenario where they may have 20 houses in construction. And if they're continually paying those at the front end, at some point, you know, they have some carrying costs. They're a big enough load there that they're having that continual carrying cost. Whereas if they could defer it, you know, they might save thousands of dollars over the course of the year. For you or I think it doesn't matter as much because, like you said, we're going to pay it one way or the other. And I suppose if I was that good at my finances, it probably would matter, but I'm not. So
I understand where you're coming from. Yep.
Well, so again, Roseanne with HBA. So the true reality of this collection later in the process, anywhere that the city feels comfortable, is really saving those carrying costs. And theoretically, those carrying costs, which over a 50 or 100 lot subdivision will be, you know, thousands of dollars on an investor's pro forma. So let's say, you know, Ben or someone, Green Hammer Construction or someone else out in Estacada is getting some, hard money lending or some conventional financing. And that will range anywhere from maybe 7-8% on the conventional side up through 12-14% on the hard money lending side. You guys know this better than me. And, for however many months over the life cycle from building permit issuance to that final inspection point, which is a little bit safer for the city than C of O. So you don't have a moving van rolling up. But in any case, that could be in Estacada, I don't know, maybe 4, 5, 6 months, maybe longer if they're, some issues, cross bureau wise or department wise. So, those carrying costs do add up. And the point I want to make about those is that, over time, the lesser costs for the construction of housing, including the carrying costs, will allow other business entities to enter the marketplace, if you will. So it will maybe not the first 1, 5, 10 houses you won't see maybe a difference in the price, but eventually the market will respond by allowing additional developers and builders to come in and see, okay, this is actually a really positive economic opportunity. We're seeing this as a competitive environment. We want to produce housing here too. And then, oh, by the way, the initial business that was, maybe pocketing that money won't be able to do that anymore. So that's the kind of like 101 economic breakdown of how that deferment would work. It would allow for a more competitive marketplace, and that those benefits are realized by the consumer or the home purchaser, household purchaser.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so suppose on a SDC deferral, the developer of a 100+ home subdivision who's using debt to build that project is probably going to enjoy the benefits more than the person who's doing 2 lots and building it with cash. So this not begs the question, but the question I guess at hand then is, do we want to continue including this in our recommendation draft?
I would say yes.
Yes.
Ben says yes. Dave Carbonneau, any thoughts or just a yes or no?
Yes. I do have a question though, and maybe it's already been covered or maybe it's already been implemented, but the word that I'm used to, I guess, in terms of affordable housing is a complete waiver. Is that part of this discussion as well? And that's, to me, that's one of the big things that have attracted affordable housing developers into communities, is not having to pay the SDC fees at all.
So I think, yes, that's part of this greater discussion. I don't know if it's what we're discussing at this very moment.
Yeah, I understand. I just wanted to understand how it fit or where it fits, but.
Yeah, I think it's a potential recommendation. It's just not the particular one we're kind of trying to form a consensus on right now.
And I already agreed on the first one.
Okay, excellent. Joe or Deborah, do you want to give an up or down on this?
Yeah, hey Matt, this is Joe. I agree. I think it should be included. One comment though is that I think in the larger holistic view of economic development, to encourage a smaller business to be involved in these kind of housing developments, it's going to require. Let me back up. I guess to the point that was made recently, it's a lot more attractive to a larger company that's going to do, let's say, a 50, 60, 100 unit development, just because the costs of carrying those capital add up so significantly over that amount of time. For a small business, and granted we're in a different industry, but we're also in construction, for a small business, there's a manpower requirement that's required to be able to take advantage of a lot of these incentives. And I think that from a cash flow perspective, deferring something to the end makes a really significant difference to a smaller company that may have more of a local impact in the greater sense for building a set of homes that might end up being more affordable. So though it's not directly related to affordable housing creation, I think it's part of the argument, and it's also very much part of the solution to greater economic growth in a smaller community. So summary is, I think it should be included. And I just wanted to make that point.
Thanks, Joe. Deborah, up or down? She may be on her other meeting. Ryan has a thumbs up. So we'll continue to include that in our recommendations. So to summarize where we're at right now, proceeding with vertical housing development zone, trying to get the county buy-in. We've eliminated a construction excise tax from the conversation, at least for now. And then going to go ahead and include the SDC deferral as a recommendation. We're then on the fourth item, and I bet this text is extremely small on your screen, but it says SDC fee restructure for multifamily housing, MFH. So in the description area there, I don't have any recommendation. I'd like to get thoughts from this group that may guide this, but if I'm gonna be completely honest, I don't think that something like this is something the city could do in-house. We would probably need to hire some sort of external consultant to really take a close look at this and come up with a recommendation of a restructured fee scenario. And it may include multifamily housing. It may include housing across the spectrum. SDCs maybe need nuances, not just by unit of housing, but by built forms, number of fixtures. You know, these are the type of things that it can get really, really nuanced. And I don't know that the city has the technical capability of doing that in-house. So if we include this in our recommendations, just recognize that the city will probably need to hire an external economic type firm to really study this. So I guess right now I'd look to hear, it sounds like there's pretty broad consensus already that yes, the city's SDC structure needs reform and needs nuance. What I look for right now, I guess, as part of that discussion is, where do you think that nuance is needed? What reforms specifically would you like someone to look at? What do you see as being problematic when you look at the city's fee structures? I think those are good starting points if we do include this in our recommendations. Well, let's start with the simple. Is either a thumbs up or a thumbs down? Yes, city's fee structure for SDCs needs reform and should be reformed. Anyone want to let's just, Heath, in agreement? Yes,
Yes,
no?
yes, it needs to be reformed.
Okay, Mr. Carpenter.
I'm going to go with yes, it needs to be reformed. I would like to ask a quick question, and then I have to step off to a 3 o'clock meeting. But is it possible for, and I know nothing about what I'm asking, which is why I'm asking, but is it possible that there is a separate multifamily housing SDC different than a house building SDC, so that if I wanted to come and build a 10,000 unit apartment complex, that's a different channel that I go to, or does that not exist in most cities?
No, I think that's exactly kind of what we're trying to get at here. I have to admit, since I'm not the person who charges the SDCs and calculates what's due for development projects, I shouldn't speak to this with complete confidence, and I can't. But my understanding is that most of our SDCs, at least as they pertain to residential projects, are charged by unit of housing. And so there's little distinction, if any, between 5,000 square foot McMansion and a 1-bedroom apartment. Okay. And that's just inherently, I think, problematic from most people's perspective.
Okay, then thank you. And in that case, I definitely say yes. Let's take a look at restructuring.
One quick thing is a system development fee is a usage-based fee in its most remedial sense. So even if you have a 5,000 square foot McMansion, which that word I haven't heard in a long time, so thanks for bringing it back up, Matt. If you have a couple and say they have one child in a 5,000 square foot house, the system development required for that is similar to or it could even be less than a 5-person family living in a 3-bedroom apartment in the city of Estacada. So 2 cars, probably in that household, they're going to have the same impact on the road, same number of showers or less potentially with the 5,000 square foot house. So I think it's worth a good look and to figure out how that lands. The other thing is in plumbing world, 2 1-inch water lines don't equal a 2-inch water line. You can have much more carrying capacity with a 2-inch water line than 2 1-inch water lines. And so as you look at that fee structure, again, it deserves a better look at, as you escalate those hookups, how those are how those are charged. I know on the water line side, if you go to a 2-inch, it's exponentially more than 2 1-inches. Yes, it should be more, but exponentially more, probably not. So, because at the end of the day, the city's going to get their piece when they get the water bill at the end of the month, and they're using X amount of gallons. And whether that comes through a 5/8 water meter, a 1-inch water meter, or a 17-inch water meter, they're still going to get that water on a monthly basis. So,
Ben, that's great. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say, hopefully I explained that in a common sense way.
Absolutely, and that's a good point that you make. That, and I know, Matt, you're still trying to see who agrees and who doesn't agree with moving forward with this, but I'm building a multi-use building in Estacada here in the near future. If I was building a 2-story massive restaurant that had hundreds of people coming into it every day with 6 restrooms in there, I wouldn't actually even get charged an SDC fee for that building because there's already one hookup for one building. And that would be classified as one business. Yet the usage would be astronomical. But since I am doing a 6-plex, 6 apartments, going to be charged over $100,000 in SDCs because you're going to have, and it would literally be hardly even, not even close to the amount of usage that a restaurant would have. So that being said, it is why, especially when you get into the multi-housing or anything over, especially when you're going vertical, because you can put in more units, that they need to do something. As far as the mansion goes, I agree, Ben, that's not going to make a difference because the usage isn't anymore. But I don't know what usage the brew pub has in waste, but I'm sure it's a whole lot more than the barbershop. But if you build a barbershop in Estacada or you build a brew pub, you're going to pay the same SDC right now. And to me, that's an issue.
So,
Something-
go ahead, Roseanne.
Something to maybe look into as kind of contemporary recent literature on this is that your own Clackamas County has recently tiered their transportation SDC, as well as they're proposing to tier their water environment services. In other words, their storm and sewer SDC. Which would, if approved by the board, would go into effect this July. And they really took a very in-depth look at some water resource literature, both in our region and in our state, as well in the Portland metro area, as well as some ACH data, American Housing data, and determined that in fact, the water usage was higher with more square footage. They used a proxy of winter water usage for that, so they wouldn't be factoring in watering gardens and crops and things like that on small farms. So it might not seem intuitive for certain SDCs, like maybe parks. I think parks are maybe the one that's a little bit more difficult to put your finger on. Like, will that 3-person household in an apartment versus a 3-person household in a 5,000 square foot house use parks any differently? That's really hard to determine. Maybe it's even opposite of what we might think. But in terms of water, the water line is based on the peak, what the peak service level would be, as I understand it. So that 5,000 square foot house is bound to have more fixtures, and therefore more people could be pulling for that peak service on the water line, regardless of how much they're paying in their actual water usage. Like the impact on the peak service is why you get sized for your water meter to be a certain size. And then that corresponds with the SDC charge. But in any case, I think it is worth a look at a potential tiered structure. And you do have some counterparts in your county that have moved forward with that. So some places to start for reaching out.
Okay. Are there any other strong opinions to vocalize? It sounds like there's consensus, and that's what I'm going to note in our minutes, that there is consensus to have the city restructure its SDC fee schedule in ways that are rational and fair across housing types and across uses, as determined objectively by some third party.
Yeah, I mean, I would phrase it as like explore the option or consider restructuring, because it might not end up making sense for Estacada based on the data that you get. But then again, it might based on the data that you get.
Yeah, I'm guessing there's room for improvement in one way or another with our fee structure. But I
Okay.
hear what you're I hear what you're saying though. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
And I think we'll put a particular emphasis, since this committee is about diverse and multifamily housing, a particularly close look at how fee structures can be modified to more fairly assess fees for housing types that may have differing burdens on the city's systems. Before we jump to the fifth recommendation, I guess I want to go back to what Dave brought up, and that was the concept of perhaps discounting or waiving SDC fees entirely for the types of housing that we're trying to see developed. Let's have some discussion on that concept.
But to put it in context, it really does come down to the definition of affordability, which traditionally has been sort of a 60% AMI threshold. And it's, at least in Portland, it's one of probably the easiest things to get if you can demonstrate that whatever you're building meets that threshold. And it's obviously enough money to get somebody's attention and willing to kind of balance that against lower rents. So if you get some cost offsets or waivers, how does that match up against your rent levels? And as long as you're in that 60%, I think it's a fair way to not only encourage people to build affordable housing, but I think it's a fair way to really get to the point of, back to the usage question, of in many cases, people on lower income don't have access to a lot of the services. And so there's a lot going on there, but I think it's at a minimum, it's a good way to get some incentives in place.
Yeah, so I would say that Portland does have a precedent for this. It's in their homebuyer opportunity limited tax exemption program, as well as their multiple unit limited tax exemption program. Both of those are governed by Oregon revised statutes and allow for the city to work kind of like the vertical housing development zone, but work with overlapping tax districts to allow for certain properties to have structural improvements built on them, as long as those structural improvements with the property sell for less than sell to a buyer that is making less than 80% of median family income, as well as the total price cap is at a certain set amount, which is tied to the affordability level for 80% median family income, then the developer gets the SDCs waived altogether. Portland has also, and other cities have set precedent, obviously, on ADUs, waiving SDCs for accessory dwelling units. So there's ample of opportunity to look at SDC waivers or partial waivers for the types of housing that the city would like to encourage as an incentive. We just would advocate that it not be, tacked on somewhere else, that it would be simply an incentive for that type of housing.
So our SDC structure for ADUs, I think, is actually one of the more logical ones that we have on our schedule. Logical and fair, I guess I should say. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Just because we discount one thing doesn't mean it should be added to something else.
Matt, did we talk about those Oregon state governed programs for multiple unit structures, as well as more single dwelling unit structures, and the partial tax abatement that comes with them, and how the city can waive the SDCs to encourage the developer to actually build them?
Yeah, I believe you mentioned that in our previous meeting.
Okay.
It didn't end up on this list, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be on it. So what I'm hearing is some consensus and support for potential waivers or discounts in SDCs for certain types of housing. And I'll try and capture this in the next iteration of our recommendations. I'll put some language in there that suggests kind of what Roseanne is getting at, and that is to try and model something after maybe what Portland does with that. What did you say the name of the program was?
Homebuyer Opportunity Limited Tax Exemption, and then multiple unit limited tax exemption.
So those are tax exemptions rather than SDC discounts?
The way that Portland implements them is that they also involve a SDC waiver. Okay. For income qualifying and for the price, meeting the price cap.
Okay. I'll bet I could probably Google my way into those, but if you know the links and can shoot them over to me, that'll save me a little bit of time. I'd appreciate it.
Sure.
So I guess before moving on then, do I in fact, am I accurate in assuming that there's some consensus on that piece to potentially explore SDC waivers or reductions for certain types of housing or housing that meets certain income qualifications and things like that? As
yes.
He says yes. Ben, up or down?
Yes, please.
Okay, Deborah?
I'm
occupied.
sorry.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Deborah.
I missed the question, so carry on without me.
Oh,
but
okay.
I am back now.
Dave Carbonneau, I'm guessing you're in support, but don't want to assume.
No, absolutely.
Okay, and Joe, any thoughts or up or down?
Yes, I agree.
So I'll include that in the next iteration. The last point we have on our list here is a potential partnership with Housing Authority of Clackamas County. That should be HACC, sorry about that, rather than CCHA. They're not in attendance, and so we may need to come back to that next meeting. So before we wrap up, then let's maybe spend 5 to 10 minutes. If any of you see things on our brainstorm list that you feel really need to be included that we have not included on this first iteration of recommendations. So I think those are on your screen, but we have down payment assistance. We have construction excise. We already talked about that. Lift funds through the state of Oregon. I believe Dave Carbonneau brought this up, and I admit I don't know enough about this, and that was the main reason it wasn't included. But Dave, can can you maybe recap this again for us?
Well, LIFT has been around for a few years, but it's primarily aimed at affordable housing. And so that we're again talking about a threshold at maybe 60 or 80%, depending on what program it is. But it's, first of all, it's a competitive program, but it's something that in many cases makes all the difference in the world if you can come in on with about a $40,000 equity on a unit that may cost $200,000. So it's becoming very critical, and it's usually coupled with tax credits of some kind. But I just think it's something that any community is, if they're really going to focus on the affordability side of, has to keep that in their toolkit. And, you know, again, what role the city plays in that versus the developer, I don't necessarily see the role that the city would play, but it's just something that I think cities should be aware of what else is out there in terms of supporting development in affordable areas. So,
Okay, thanks for that recap. And I do recall Googling it a bit now, and now that you describe it, it kind of comes back to me. And I had that same question as well. Where does the city come into this? Because as I understood it, it was something a developer would apply for directly. Is that right?
yes.
Okay. So maybe we don't include it in the recommendations, but we certainly remember it in conversations that we may have with potential multifamily.
I've always thought about a role cities can play in many cases, you know, trying to fill the gap, which we kind of, what we spend our time doing is try to figure out how much something costs and then figure out where the money comes from. But, you know, I've always felt that there are other ways cities can play in this, and through guarantees and other mechanisms that might help kind of facilitate a small loan. And I don't know where the city of Estacada is in some of this, and I've beat my head against the wall many times trying to convince the city of Portland that they would be, it'd be a better use of their time and energy is to put their balance sheet behind transactions and to get something across the finish line.
Yeah, I think that's a tough one with a city as small as Estacada to be guaranteeing someone else's project or debt seems like a tall order. But anyway, any additional thoughts there? I'll continue down the list. Foundations and philanthropic money. I think that's worthwhile, but is that something we recommend to the city council? Yeah, I don't know. Anyone hold strong opinions about that particular item?
Well, Matt, because this one is the only one I see that is even close to the idea of the city using their own property that they own and then contracting with a builder or developer of, you know, affordable or market rate to build on their property. That was the only thought that perked up to me when looking at this list. That's where it would fall, if anywhere.
Okay. Yeah, the city actually doesn't own a ton of property, much at all. That's not, you know, home to a sewer plant or a water.
Yeah. Okay.
Or a public works facility, for example. But we are actually considering right now the relocation of our sewer plant, in which case the current site would then be surplused. So maybe that's an opportunity.
Down the road.
Yeah. Not too far down the road, actually, but 2 to 5 years. Reducing parking requirements for multifamily housing. Strong feelings about this. Right now, the requirement is that just downtown or is that everywhere in the city? Taylor, do you remember? It's one parking spot per unit, but is that just downtown or is that citywide?
I think that's everywhere.
Okay.
The reduction in there's the downtown, you know, parking reduction option.
Okay, yeah, that's right.
But the code section on, we just have that table in the code section on off-street parking. And unless a certain zone has something that's different from what's in that table, then it applies everywhere. So I don't think that there are zones that specify different requirements for multifamily.
Okay.
But, Matt, but adding that, at least for the downtown area, in my opinion, is going to be beneficial to the city long term. Just referencing back to the building I'm getting ready to build, going 3 stories or 4 stories was not an option because of parking.
Mhm.
And it could have allowed more housing in the downtown area. And most of those people are either riding a bus, riding a bike. And in a lot of downtown areas, they do away with that. So if it's the same downtown as it is everywhere else in the city, then something else then that's not right, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it is the same citywide, but as Taylor mentioned, there are a few reductions available if you're downtown, and then further reductions depending on where you are downtown. I believe it's 20% off of your required parking right out of the chute if you're in the D zone, and then additional 10% reduction if you're within a certain distance from a public transportation stop.
So basically anywhere from 0.7 to 0.8 spaces, depending on where you are downtown per unit.
Yeah, I think that's accurate.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing more on a citywide basis or in broader swaths of jurisdictions. Now that they're really having to grapple with, okay, housing, the trade-off between housing and parking. And since a lot of efforts, have gone towards multimodal transportation, and I realize Estacada is a rural city still, so it might not make as much sense as the closer in cities, but getting a greater amount of properties with either an overlay or just an outright by right allowance of a 0.7 or 0.8 per unit would go a long way towards getting additional housing units, because you're replacing parking with housing.
Right. Okay, so if we include that in our next iteration, I guess I want to have some guidance as to what that might sound like. So would we are we saying we would like them to consider a parking reduction below 1 space per unit citywide, no matter the price point of the housing, or are we of the multifamily housing, or are we saying parking reduction below 1 space per unit if the housing meets certain thresholds, like 60% AMI for rent, for example? How nuanced do we want to make this?
Well, I think you could start simple, and then if council wants to direct it to become more tiered or complex, they could, but you could start simple and make it, all of the downtown and any of your mixed use employment zones or mixed use residential zones could have that application as well, and that would allow for more flexibility and creativity when the developer looks at where they're going to build.
Okay, I think that's, yeah, I think I can work with that in terms of putting together a new.
That makes sense to me.
Okay. All right, briefly wrapping up then, this is back to what Deborah was talking about, code or programs that would allow for transitional housing in targeted areas. I think this deserves more conversation, and we're running out of time. So let's have more conversation on this one next meeting. And maybe I'll say that about all of what follows. The remaining items on the list are, and I'm not sure I remember the idea behind this one. It just says research voucher availability. Let's see here. Making sure that policy, zoning, and goals are aligned. I think we've largely achieved that through recent rezoning efforts, but we can talk more about that. A way to get skin in the game from all constituents. So maybe that's a tax on all properties, or maybe that looks like a general obligation levy or bond. I looked at that when I was putting together this, and that was where I felt like that was a tough one to meet that threshold of political feasibility. Estacada School District has had a hell of a time getting a bond to pass in this city, and if anyone can get behind anything, it's usually education. And so to say that we're going to increase people's property taxes for the purposes of affordable housing feels to me politically infeasible, but maybe I'm a pessimist. Let's see here. I think the others we've covered, besides maybe looking at federal and state infrastructure support. So let's have some more discussion on maybe some of those next meeting. I'll try and put together a new iteration of recommendations, and we'll plan to meet again in about a month. I'll send out a doodle again as I did last time, and hopefully arrive at a time that works for everyone. Anyone want to share or comment or gripe about anything before we adjourn?
One final comment, Matt, would be maybe take. Whoa.
Ben,
Is
you're
that
back.
Deborah?
Ben, you sound like a robot.
Can you hear me?
A little bit better.
Move around, Ben. Move around.
All right, Roseanne was going to say something.
No, it's me, Ben. Can you hear me?
Yes,
A little better now. Yeah.
I'm moving. I'm going 45.
Can't hear you. Blank. All blank.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm stopping.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry everybody. I got to get at it to another meeting, but I had something as I was driving home a minute ago that we didn't discuss, and it might be worthy of noting. Historically, in these rural areas, affordable housing comes in the way of trailer parks. They're not sexy and not often talked about, but it does offer a niche of housing that gives people some ownership in that they can buy their own trailers or double wides or single wides, whatever it is. And you can get a lot of units per acre with some limited infrastructure and skin in the game by a developer, I guess. So I don't know what more we could dive into, but you know, historically, as of late, we don't talk about trailer parks because they're, again, not sexy, but it might be worth looking at.
Okay. Well, I'll note that in the minutes and see if we can discuss that in more detail next meeting. Roseanne, you had a thought before we adjourn.
Yes. So maybe would it be possible to take your short list that you've created in addition to what we've talked about today, and for this group to have a guest speaker from the Land Conservation and Development Department potentially on House Bill 2003 housing production strategies, because essentially a lot of these fall under a list that is sort of a working list that a bunch of affordable and market rate housing advocates and agencies have put together, and it's categorized. You might already have seen it, but there's like, I don't know, 12, maybe 10 different categories of housing production strategies. And like I said, you know, the strategies range from everything we've talked about would fit in there. And so it might make sense to invite, you know, someone who's worked on these like across jurisdictions and be able to kind of speak to them or speak to like what other cities are doing or counties might be doing. So that's just an idea for a future meeting, is to either have, you know, a guest consultant or someone from the department down there at the Land Conservation Development.
Okay.
Department of Land Conservation Development.
Yeah, I think we know who our DLCD rep is, but I wonder if there's like a program manager specifically for what you're talking about. Does a name come to mind by any chance?
Yeah, so I know that Sean Edging might be somewhere to start. He's been very involved with 2001 as well as 2003. And if he doesn't do it, then he might know of the best person.
Okay.
for the housing strategies.
Okay, and we can certainly inquire with our rep as well and get pointed in the right directions.
Okay, but yeah, I'll get a name from Sean as well if it's not him.
Okay,
I know
super.
I also know Sean and would be happy to reach out to him with that request.
Okay, yeah, go. You can do that then, Taylor.
Super. Okay, well, thanks for everyone's participation. We'll hope to have more participants next meeting. Thanks for your time. We are adjourning at 3:32 p.m. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you.